Hi, I'm James Preston Poole, and you're listening to the Full Circle Network. We're going to be covering Lovecraft Country, episodes 5 and 6. Here I have with me my guests.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm a critic and feature writer for Full Circle.
Hi, I'm Noah. I'm a critic and feature writer for Full Circle as well.
And I'm Mark, the managing critic for Full Circle Cinema.
So, as I said, we're going to be covering episodes 5 and 6 of Lovecraft Country. Be warned, if you haven't seen episodes 5 and 6, this is going to contain spoilers for those episodes. No non-spoiler section. So first, we're going to go ahead and dive into Lovecraft Country episode 5, Strange Case. Our trusty IMDb summary says that this episode is about: after making a devil's bargain with William, Ruby steps into the charmed shoes of a white woman, but her transformation only fortifies her resentment of the racial divide. A betrayal by Montrose unleashes Atticus's pent-up rage, leaving Letty deeply disturbed and sending Montrose into the comforting arms of his secret lover. Alright guys, initial impressions.
One thing that I think this episode really highlighted that is something I love about the series is magic in this universe is just so bloody. It's such a visceral thing. Just seeing all the transformation sequences of Ruby, and then, of course, at the end, William. I just thought it was very compelling, and I feel like the series has finally gotten into its own, where each episode's a different short story, like a different pulp story, but still connected in the same universe. And I really enjoyed Ruby's story in this one. And then just as a fan of drag in general, I really enjoyed the scene at the drag queen ball. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was just delightful in every way. I like what you said about the character focus on some of these episodes, because episodes 2 and 4 have been the most contentious of the series for this podcast. With episode 2, the majority of us liked it, but episode 4 was kind of a slog for a lot of us because it was just picking up so many pieces. What I really enjoyed about this episode was that it took one concept, one thread, and just tried to mine all the dramatic tension they could out of it and fully explore the themes without trying to get too caught up in what else was going on in the world of Lovecraft Country.
The gore in this episode is part of why I enjoyed it so much. Not just one, but there are multiple transformation sequences that are so disgusting, and it's just amazing. It's just so awesome to see that in a high-budget TV show. The, practical, gore that's just, ooh, it makes you want to, wince when you see it. The concept in itself is very intriguing, a black woman, being able to transform into a white woman, and then playing with the reality of that, but also playing with the body horror side of that. I think that was a brilliant kind of pairing of themes and genres.
And speaking of the body horror of it all, this is the first time I got a sense of some of the executive producers that were on here, most notably Jordan Peele, because a lot of this concept reminded me of an inverse version of Get Out, except this time it's a black woman getting into the body of a white person and trying to take advantage of what it's like to live with that privilege, and just to see what that perspective is from white people, because when you learn more about the situation from Christina Braithwaite, she basically tells Ruby, the whole goal isn't to make you a white person, it's to do whatever you want. But the fact that this is Christina saying this, her being white, even though she's not meaning that through her words, she's definitely meaning that just through realizing what the world's like and how the only real way for a black person to really feel free at a time like this is to basically shed away their own skin, or in this case, hide behind the skin. 75% of this episode, I would say, is my favorite episode of this whole series because of just how well focused it is on a character perspective with Ruby. Because prior to this episode, I felt like Ruby wasn't really that interesting of a character. In fact, the entire time we spent with Ruby in episode 4 was one of the big reasons why I felt that episode 4 was such a slog. But now that we have focus on her entirely, we now see what she's really like, both in her own skin and somebody else's, and how she can easily adapt in all these different situations.
And something you touched on that I really appreciate in this episode was when Christina was talking to Ruby about their struggles as women. Ruby was so quick to shut her down, because something I see often where people think that because they're discriminated against in one way, it means that discrimination is universal. And I appreciated Ruby very clearly defining to Christina, like, your suffering is not my suffering. Like, my burden is not your burden. The big character focus of Ruby, just thought it was so compelling. And I agree. It was kind of a slog watching her in the last episode, but that payoff was worth it.
Absolutely. Another thing I think this episode did is managing to communicate those messages while still keeping that same Pulp Fiction genre appeal. The fact that they still put the horrors of the real world and these very over-the-top concepts right next to each other, strengthening both at the same time. I think this episode in particular works as a great little horror piece on its own as much as it does as a stirring social commentary.
Yeah, and I think that's when the show's at its best, when its episodes work as their own tales of terror. We'll talk about it later, but that's, I think, why episode 6 is so compelling.
It's almost like this show is an anthology of sorts that just happens to share common threads.
Yeah. If the anthology part is more interesting than the overall narrative, there might be an issue there. But, yeah.
I'd be interested in finishing the book to see how much of the book takes place in its own separate pockets. Because so far, the show reads more to me almost like comics more than it does a single novel kind of narrative. Does anyone else get that vibe?
Yeah, like each issue's got its own theme, but it's continuing the story. It's just like different villain, different scenario.
I really appreciate how they didn't skimp on Ruby getting her very violent, bloody revenge at the end.
Oh my god, that scene.
It was a lot, and it's really contentious, and I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts on it.
I mean, at first I thought it was like a very intensive scene. I thought it was well done, but then I saw that some people thought it was kind of in poor taste since it's in the same episode as the inclusion of like the drag scenes in that community to then end with a character being anally penetrated as like punishment. I heard some like mixed takes on that and how if that was really handled super well.
It's a little tricky because, on one hand, the reason revenge plot lines are in so many movies and TV shows is because it's very easy to identify with the person getting revenge. It's very easy to identify with Ruby, and I did support her giving Paul his comeuppance and seeing him taken down a peg, but it was just so viscerally brutal. And it's like, well, she gets justice, but it's more like this violent retribution, and it's just sort of all tangled up in this thing where you don't want to say, I approve of her penetrating him with a stiletto heel, but it's just all confusing, and I understand why it's a point of contention for this episode.
Yeah, it's confusing not just in that way, but in that scene, it's also emblematic of one of the problems that I've had in this episode. It's a problem I've had with this show in general, but it's especially a problem here. And it's the particular use of modern songs. And in this case, this is set to the hip-hop track of Cardi B's Bodak Yellow. And just that alone just never sat quite right with me. When that scene happened, it took a while for me to actually be bothered by the fact that this was in the same episode as the whole thing with Montrose and the drag community. I spent most of the first couple seconds of that scene just wondering, why is this show so committed to doing all these modern songs? And with this particular one, it just felt out of place. It just distracted me from what should be this really intense and cathartic scene because, as we see earlier, Paul is this really terrible misogynistic guy, and I should be fully engaged with what's happening to him because of Ruby, but it was a little bit hard for me to engage with it because the show likes to do those modern songs so much. But getting past that, I think the issue for me with having the scene with Ruby putting this little heel up Paul's butt and the whole thing with Montrose is just the fact that they share the same space. I feel like if those two plot lines took place in just different episodes, I wouldn't have any problems. But since they're almost minutes between each other, it creates this parallel that is definitely distracting. And while I'm not going to say that I'm of the community, it is something that I do recognize, and I totally understand why others will be upset.
It feels more like, oh, we need a B-plot this episode, let's put Montrose and Sammy in there. It could have been paired with an A story a little bit better.
I definitely want to talk about more of Montrose, but I want to wrap up just a little bit, bouncing off of what Mark was saying. That Cardi B needle drop and just the whole way the scene was played, I don't think when taken in a vacuum necessarily that the scene would have been as uncomfortable in all the wrong ways as it was if it weren't played as cathartic as it was. Like, they didn't really leave a lot of room for you to be like, oh, is she doing the right thing by doing this horrible act of violence? Instead, it's treated in the same way that Letty smashing bricks off the cars was. And that really didn't sit right with me. However, I am glad that this episode wasn't as tough to stomach in that realm as episode 4 was. But this show still has a bit of a ways to go in terms of being sensitive to a lot of the other things they're portraying.
Yeah, and another thing I noticed is, I mean, obviously episode 4, the murder at the end of that character caused quite a stir. And then it kind of bothered me that not only like an episode later, the character that senselessly slits the other one's throat is given this wonderful redemption arc, this wonderful cathartic episode. It just felt strange to me. The fact that we just saw him doing this horrendous thing that really struck a flame with the audience over this past week. And then for like that aftermath got thrown away the first like 10 minutes of the episode. And then, okay, we put that aside. Now we can have fun with this character again. And I don't know if they're associating enough weight with what happened at the end of episode 4 with the future of this character.
We'll definitely have to see what Montrose's plotline is going forward, but it certainly was jarring, to say the least, to see him get this really tender, sweet arc while still leaving up in the air the fact that he was horribly abusive towards his son and his merciless slaughtering of the character in the previous episode. What did y'all in general think of Montrose's arc in this character, not only in relation to the last episode, but also taken on its own?
I'm just not really sure because, of course, gay people can be abusers too. But it's just oscillating between this thing where it wants to celebrate and sort of be like, look, we have a gay person in this show. And then he's also a murderer and an abuser. And then the whiplash between episode 4 and 5. I don't know. I feel like they don't really know what they're doing with this character. But again, we still have 4 more episodes to go, so we'll see. But I just feel like they wanted a gay character in there. And then they just kind of made Montrose fit that mold.
I've also seen a lot of people taking issue with the idea of gay characters being seen as repressed, violent people before they're out. And that's something that's sat with me with Montrose, and I really just need to keep an eye on where this character's arc is going, and if he gets his proper being taken to task for the things that he's done. Because his arc was joyous to watch in this episode on its own, but it just raises a lot more questions. What did y'all think of that twist at the end of this episode that Christina and William were actually one and the same?
Oh my gosh, she's such a creep.
I love it. If y'all haven't seen The Neon Demon, y'all need to check that movie out, because the wonderful Abby Lee is just as creepy in that movie. And to learn that we've secretly been seeing more Christina Braithwaite this whole time, music to my ears. I loved it.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not super wrapped up in their little storyline, and I know that's weird to say since it's like the main antagonist, but I just keep being way more interested in the pocket stories with the weird subgenres like the haunted house or body transformation or episode 6's creature, because I hated episode 2. I'm like the one out of all of us who hated episode 2 because of how much it focused on that whole cult of people. I don't quite get it nor feel very interested in it. I will say she's a good actor. I like her performance, but nothing really strikes me as super interesting with that character other than being magical and kind of an asshole.
It was definitely something that I didn't see coming, and although there are certain clues of it spread out here and there, mainly in the fact that it's not that often where you see William and Christina in the same scene, both seeing the twist itself but also seeing how it's executed with the beautiful gore effects, it was definitely one of the moments that just made me so happy. And this was already after the fact that I am a big fan of Abby Lee because of both Neon Demon and even the little screen time she got in Fury Road.
I just think that the overarching story of the Braithwaites and everything is just not interesting because it just feels vague. It's like Atticus has this power. It's like the language of Adam. And it just feels like we don't know much about it and there doesn't really seem to be like any stakes with it. And so that's kind of why the pocket stories feel much more compelling, which is why I love the next episode.
First of all, nice transition. Second of all, I completely agree. We're going to go ahead and move on to Lovecraft Country, episode 6, Meet Me in Daegu. The storyline for this episode, thanks once again to our trusty IMDb summary, is in the throes of the Korean War, nursing student Jia crosses paths with a wounded Atticus, who has no recollection of their violent first encounter. I'm going to be honest, y'all, this is easily my favorite episode of the series so far. It takes exactly what y'all have been saying about how the show really succeeds when it does these one-off episodes and explores a character who we haven't seen to this point and tells this haunting, beautiful, complicated story set in the shadow of the Korean War that really just left me speechless.
I love spending time in pretty much an entirely different atmosphere, entirely different color palette. I thought the leading performance, what's her name again?
Jamie Chung.
Yeah, she was phenomenal. I mean, I can't even pinpoint a specific reason why she's phenomenal, but I think it's just her screen presence and the way she conveys emotion. And I mean, we haven't spent really any time with this character, and she has the tough job of having the audience feel on her side for only one episode for this. And I think almost immediately you can connect with her. And even after it's revealed that there's furry tentacled things living in her, you still feel for her and you are intrigued by this burden she has and the way you have this feeling that it's only a matter of time before Atticus gets intertwined with this because, you know, he had worked in the war and that we had a feeling this would come back into play. And then when the storylines do cross and you leave the isolated world of this story and merge it with the Lovecraft narrative, I think it works really, really well. There's a lot to love in this episode. Like, even just the scenes in the hospital are pretty horror-centric. And then, of course, the first kill is incredibly disgusting.
Yahoo!
This episode just sidelined me so much on every single level, not only in the fact that we're following a character that we've not seen very much other than the one glimpse of Jia in episode 2, and also the fact that it commits so much to being this Korean War drama that almost half or even 2/3 of the episode is in Korean. Even the title of Lovecraft Country, when the title appears, we also see it written in Korean. I spent the first 10 minutes of this episode just bewildered at how this is the first episode where it finally committed to being the anthology series that it tried to be, but it seemed to not quite be because it seems to introduce certain subplots and mix them around a little too much. And with this one, the most it gets at being a Lovecraft Country episode is the presence of Atticus. For the most part, it's just this episode of following Jia and her struggling as this monster of sorts, and her trying to become more human, and her being frustrated at the fact that the only thing that's keeping her from being human is the fact that she needs to kill one more person, even though, based on the people that she's already killed, she already has an idea of the emotions that humans go through and how she seems to be overwhelmed a lot. And a lot of the reason why this episode works as much as it does is because of how well Jamie Chung expresses a sense of wide-eyed innocence. Because of that, it's easy to buy her character as someone who feels oblivious at the horrible things that she does and the pain that she has once she meets Atticus and decides that Atticus is someone she wants to actually be with and not just be another victim. I would say overall, this episode, I'm not sure if it's my number one favorite of the series, but it's the one episode I've been satisfied the most since episode 2.
Yeah, and even though Atticus is kind of a smaller part in this episode, it provided such needed insight into his past, and we really got to see the demons he's been carrying around this whole time. Especially the glimpses of memory that she saw within him of him pulling out the nurse's teeth. I just thought it really added a lot of depth to his character, and it answered a lot of questions that I had about him. And I just love the monsters in this show. I love the monster design so much. Just so freaky and wonderful.
They really are feeding those horror fans well with all these great creature designs every episode. If Lovecraft Country does one thing well, it's those dang monster designs.
Oh, yeah.
I was pretty much prepared for her to be this octopus creature, but what I wasn't expecting was the tentacles to come out of her nostrils and her eyes. The fact that it came out of her eyes just alone, that disturbed me even more than the subsequent killing that she does by making a guy explode. But just seeing the whole tentacles coming out of the eyes, I felt like just from that, I was already sold on the idea that the one thing that it does 100% right every time is those creature designs.
It just works so well because at the beginning, she's dancing in a movie theater to a musical. She's just a normal girl. And in hindsight, it's like, there's such a sheen over musicals where it's like everyone beautiful and happy and everything's colorful and there's always a happy ending. And so it's like, no wonder she loves musicals so much. To her, that's what peak human emotion is, like love and happiness and joy. By the end, she's really fighting to have a piece of that for herself. Just such a compelling character. I really loved her.
The scene where Atticus reveals the little makeshift movie theater legitimately gave me chills. That was one of the most genuine moments of character interaction and love I've seen in the show so far. Like, it was really, really sweet.
Y'all are completely right. I think there's a lot to be said about this show's continued exploration of how fiction provides an escape from the horrors of our own realities. There's even a line in this episode between Gia and Atticus about, "Your movies are my books." And it almost breaks the fourth wall pretty hard. We're living in very uncertain times right now, and we're using fiction like this as a sort of escape. So to see these characters finding that same sort of escape within the fiction we're watching, I don't know. It's simple, and it's probably something that is incredibly obvious to everyone who watched, but it really was special to me.
Does anyone have any criticisms or anything they didn't like about the episode?
This also just goes in line with characters doing really horrendous things, and it gets glossed over. When Atticus shoots the nurse, I get that he was following orders, but seeing him do that and the way he looked while doing that really, for me, hurt my image of his character. And it was also really strange how fast he falls in love with her, because I was just waiting for her to bring up the fact that he shot her friend like point blank and took her other friend to torture, and it just seemed like a pretty extreme thing for him to do. And again, it just gets like glossed over, and we're supposed to rejoice in his love, which I did. I loved that relationship, but at the same time, I was like, he really just like point blank shot someone. It was a little much, at least for his character. I think there are other ways you can show him being, a soldier at war without offing someone. She wasn't even the communist. It was just someone who was like crying, and he just shot her in the face. But yeah, that's my main critique.
This episode didn't quite go all the way with its criticism of American soldiers and the American military complex and the whole attitude of anti-communism. It was definitely there, and it was used to characterize that Atticus was a monster in his own way, and Gia was a monster in her own way. However, she did what she had to do because she literally had to. And while he was just following orders, it didn't feel like there was that equal parallel between them. And I would have liked to have seen them go further with the scathing criticism of the American military and the Korean War. But then again, it's kind of a rough situation, because if you expanded more on that, you might have less time developing Gia, or you may have more time. That element was just the one that didn't quite hit for me.
Maybe in the next episode, Atticus will experience a bit of a reckoning, because this was setting up his past, and he just discovered the message written in the language of Adam. And so I'm hopeful that some of these concerns will be addressed in the next episode.
I'm worried that there could be setting up Gia to be a little bit of a deus ex machina to save the day with her powers. Because it's such a wonderful character, and I'm worried she's being introduced mainly as a function to fix things near the end, and I really don't want that.
Does she even have control over her powers?
She said she did, but it did not seem like it at the end there.
Yeah, because I don't know if she's like super furry tentacle woman, or she can choose when she uses her monster tentacle furry thing powers. Yeah, I could definitely see her intervening, especially with that emphasis on her being really freaked out by her vision of Atticus in trouble. They're definitely going to tie her back in, and I assume it will be supernatural.
You guys commenting on how this could function later on the show. The big criticism I have towards this is just a side effect of it being so much of an anthology episode, because I honestly have no idea how I could see this progress forward, because from what we've seen of how other episodes progress over others, it's pretty inconsistent. The whole idea of episode 5 not really following up very much on the horrible thing that Montrose did in episode 4. What I'm worried about is if this is going to have an impact on the later episodes at all. Maybe Gia will be some Deus Ex Machina that'll come in, or maybe she'll just be something that's very minor that'll only affect something related to Atticus's character, but for me, all this is just still up in the air, and the ending does not do a very strong job hinting at what really could happen, other than Gia will have to deal with more pain in the future. But it's not really connected to anything that we've seen in the 5 episodes prior to that. So yeah, I guess this episode is so good at doing the things that it wants to do that it sort of ignores the things that the other episodes tried to do. That's my biggest criticism.
It almost just comes back to the point where this show may have functioned better just as an anthology, so we didn't even have to worry about the overarching plot in any sense.
I mean, Atticus could have very well been any random soldier, and the storyline would play the same, really, except for the ending.
Honestly, it would be pretty cool, just in theory at least, if each episode was just like different story in Atticus's book or something, if they structured it like that. But I guess we shall see, and I agree with Mark that the show's track record for keeping up with past plot threads hasn't been the greatest, but I really love Gia, so I'm holding out hope. I hope the writers don't mess her up.
I just hope that Misha Green and the other people involved know how to utilize both Gia and Jamie Chung in the main plot, because this is pretty divorced from the main plot. I mean, this is a prequel of sorts, so I just hope that they find good ways to incorporate her in. That's all.
On that note, do y'all have any final thoughts on episodes 5 and 6 of Lovecraft Country?
I'll say it's getting better. Definitely more consistent in quality than it was in its first 3 or 4 episodes.
I agree. I hope they have the stamina to keep up that quality through to the end and give us a nice little conclusion.
I second that. Episodes 5 and 6 have definitely been some of the stronger of the series to me. So if they can keep this momentum going, Lovecraft Country will hopefully be something we're all positive on by the end. So that concludes this episode of Full Circle Network covering Lovecraft Country, episodes 5 and 6. This has been James Preston Poole, lead critic of Full Circle Cinema.
This has been Audrey, critic and feature writer.
Noah, critic and feature writer as well.
Mark, the managing critic of Full Circle Cinema.
And we will see y'all next time. Bye.